Good morning, ChurchOne. Early last month, I was walking on a beach in Florida with a good friend. My friend was walking her two dogs. As usual, we were heartily engaged in conversation, kind of lost in our own world. Intermittently, I would make eye contact with her, and then I'd look back down at the sand, looking for shells that I might want to pick up on our walk. So after we went a reasonable distance, we turned around and we started to head back to our house along the same beach we had just walked. Out of the corner of my eye, I spot a father and his young son. They're fishing together. Now, I'm related to people who love to fish off the beach. So I asked a very common question, hey, are you catching anything? To which the father sarcastically replied, oh, yeah, we got a whole bucket of fish. Now I'm thinking, okay, he's having a bad day, he's not catching anything. And then he goes on. You saw us come down here. We've only been here for 5 minutes. How could we have caught anything? My friend and I just keep walking. I say to her, isn't that just like a man to assume that we saw him? I would not have known if he had been there 5 minutes or 5 hours, obviously. I had not seen him setting up on the beach minutes ago, or would I have asked the question? He was making an assumption, which was, we saw him the first time we walked by. I was making an assumption as well. All men think that what they're doing at any given time is just mesmerizing to us little ladies. We were probably both wrong. We all make assumptions every day. When you walked in here this morning, if you've been here before, you assumed there would be coffee in the lobby. There'd be a few announcements, some singing, a few thoughts shared by a ChurchOne teacher. Well, so far, so good. But what else? What else do you come in the door with this morning? What assumptions have you made about God? Depending on what your experience has been with church up until now, there could be other thoughts and expectations that are rolling around inside of you. I've talked about my experience growing up. I grew up in the church, and when I was a kid, I just wanted the service to be really short. I didn't find it interesting. At Calvary Undenominational in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that was the name of our church. We had church, and then we had Sunday school. It didn't happen like it does at ChurchOne, where the kids take off before the talking part starts. Everybody sat through the whole service, and then kids and adults went to Sunday school. Most kids didn't even understand how those two words could go together. Sunday school. This was not meant to be. I thought some of the songs were okay in the service. I never really understood why we sang every verse. Or when we didn't sing every verse, who was the one who picked which verses we sang? I always wanted to act up a little bit. I had a lot of energy. But I knew my mom would take me out of the service if I acted up, and it only happened once that I can remember. You don't want to make mama mad at church, do you? Lesson 1. I was scared at church. We were there a lot. Pioneer Girls Monday nights, prayer meeting Wednesday night, youth group on the weekends, 2 services Sunday morning and night. My teachers would always talk about Jesus coming back and would we be ready when he did. I was convinced I was not ready for any number of reasons. So at 12, I prayed with my mom one Monday night after Pioneer Girls to follow him. Because my teacher had asked me at the end of our meeting a question I had heard before. And that was, if you knew where you were going to go tonight if you died. Well, that was terrifying. So I figured that I better take care of that before I could get any sleep when my head hit the pillow that night. I also heard a lot of people at church say things about Judgment Day, like how we might have to stand before God, be held accountable for all the bad things we've done in our lives before he would let us into heaven. Talk about the ultimate binge-watching situation. That could go on for days. It all seemed really scary to me. I also felt like girls who acted up at church, like in Sunday school class, were worse than the boys who did. Seemed like people just expected boys to act up. I learned early that girls were supposed to be quieter in church, not outspoken. I had questions. I had a lot of questions. For those of us who grew up in the church, our first impressions of who God was were influenced by what we experienced in these places, in these houses of God, where we were first learning about him. So if I had to sum it up, and I've been asking people lately, what was your first impression of God and how old were you when you first had it? But I think my overriding thought back then was fear. Fear I wasn't getting it right, I might not end up in heaven, I wasn't quiet enough. It's not just at church where you learn about God. So my mom was a fearful person of many things. I think she struggled with feeling worthy of God's love and acceptance. That was a big theme for her. So I got into a conversation with my husband, Ed, yesterday, because his experience growing up was much different. He did not grow up in the church. The only time he heard God's name brought up in his house was when someone said, "God damn it." There were Christians in his extended family, aunts, uncles, his dad's dad, his grandpa, but nobody at home. He remembers as a kid all the other families in his neighborhood going to church on Sundays. He'd be outside like riding his bike or washing his dad's car. The Christian Reformed Church was very well represented in the city we grew up. It did not allow for doing other things outside of going to church on Sunday. So no outdoor activities. So he didn't have any other kids in the neighborhood to hang out with when Sunday rolled around, and he would get looks, by the families when they drive by as he was outside washing the car. When I asked him about his first impressions of God, he talked about his grandpa, someone who always took an interest in Ed. On Sunday afternoons, the extended family would go to his grandparents' house for dinner, and his grandfather would recite the Lord's Prayer before dinner while everyone stood around the table in a circle. Ed found that very mysterious. Made him think God was mysterious, kind of curious. His grandpa would also ask him to help him get things from their fruit cellar, which was really what they called like a Michigan basement. Do you know what a Michigan basement is? Okay, it's like dirt and stone, and it's got a low ceiling. It's kind of not really, very primitive basement. And down there, they had all kinds of canned stuff, and his grandma would can stuff. So his grandpa would talk to him about Jesus and God when they would go down there to get canned peaches or potatoes. He knew that nobody at home was having these kinds of conversations with his grandson. As Ed and I talked about his early impressions of God, it became clear that there was a certain freedom in having kind of a blank slate on that subject. He didn't have any bad experiences with the church or other Christians that he was carrying around and trying to move past. He went on to mention other people of faith who he encountered as a kid who were kind to him. In fact, that was the image of God he had, that God was good and God was kind. Much different from how I grew up. He always felt very comforted within the Christian community. I was always suspicious of these people. So why do these things matter? Because when I read Psalm 29 in a few minutes, written by David about God, I think our backgrounds can color how we receive these words, how we interpret who God is. Ed felt pursued by God. I felt held accountable. Obviously, the longer you walk with God and follow him, look for and listen to him, the more some of those early impressions change. The less likely you are to focus on disappointments you've had with people who also follow God. So there's a woman named Mary Jo Sharp, and she's written a book. It's called Why I Still Believe, a former atheist reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God. She's now a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University, but she writes about her early experiences in the church as a young believer. Now, these are in the 2000s. She goes, this isn't back in 1980, as I read these stories to you. So she was a young believer, and she was also somebody who liked to ask a lot of questions. She was not that quiet, and you know what they like at church. So when she was doing research for this book, she found a study of who she called young outsiders, people in their 20s and 30s who did not consider themselves to be Christians, didn't go to church. 84% claimed to know at least one person who was a Christian. Only 15% thought the lifestyles of those who followed Christ were any different from those who did not. So in the book, Mary Jo describes her first experience in a church after she decided to follow Christ. She had no background with Christianity of any kind growing up, but she married a man who was a believer. And he had grown up in the church. So he kind of knew what to expect, and when criticism came or whatever, he would let it kind of roll It was interesting, off his back. So one of the first people she met as a new believer in church, she walked in. It was an older woman who told her that what she was wearing was not appropriate. Mary Jo had grown up in Oregon. She said the number of people who even went to church there was far lower than in Oklahoma, where she and her husband were now living. She said it seemed like everyone in Oklahoma went to church. She thought she had chosen the best of her two dresses. Must have been more of a formal kind of church. That Sunday, she chose the one with a conservative neckline. They didn't have a lot of money. She asked her husband what he thought. Does this look appropriate? They went off to church. And he kind of talked her into, hey, don't worry, it's okay, don't let that color your whole. So they stayed in that church for 5 years. Her husband even worked part-time as a youth pastor there, and eventually they left to attend another church, one where he got an offer to lead worship. The first Sunday there, woman approached them. Thanks, women, you're so good at saying what you think, right? Woman approached them after the service to tell them she didn't like the songs they chose. The music was too loud. There was too much noise coming from those drums. We can't hear the organ. Mary Jo's early church experiences made her believe that Christians were only interested in what seemed like superficial things. So I just want to read a couple thoughts from that point on. What I found in the church was a bunch of superficially polite people who were very much lacking in personal introspection and self-discipline, theological depth, philosophical intelligence, and sacrificially loving friendships. Of course, the entire church wasn't this way, but as I sometimes do, I began to wholesale the situation. I accumulated all my former bad experiences with people in the church, all of my hurt, and I brought everything into my current circumstance. What it all came down to was that I didn't leave my atheism in order to find a nicer environment of nice people in their culture of being polite. I could find those things in circles of atheist friends. Instead, I was looking for a life-changing, Christ-focused community, a church family with real accountability to a transcendent and objective good that they pursued as actually true. And it was nowhere to be found. By the end of our time at that second church, my faith in people had flatlined, and my faith in God needed resuscitation. Despite my disappointment, a sobering analogy kept coming to mind, a memory of when our daughter Emily was born. As we were getting ready to take our newborn baby home, Roger pulled the car up to the hospital door. I walked out of the hospital with Emily in my arms and into a cloud of cigarette smoke. A few doctors and nurses were outside taking a smoke break. I was appalled at this scene of sheer hypocrisy, disgusted that I had to walk through this cloud of smoke with my newborn. Later, I began to understand that just because the doctors and nurses knew smoking was bad for their health didn't mean they always acted like that belief was true. In this case, they had adopted lifestyles in direct rebellion to one of the truths of their own profession. Similarly, I knew that though people could say they believed in God, they didn't always act like it was true. Further, some of them had made choices directly opposed to the teachings of their own beliefs. As a minister's wife, I was not afforded space to struggle with doubt, nor could I ask hard questions. My analytical mind and interest in philosophy also isolated me from most people in our churches. I noticed an underlying distrust of me. I began to earnestly question my belief in God within the first decade of becoming a Christian. What originally began as doubt turned into intellectual questioning, driven by a desire to leave the church and Christianity behind. Yet something else pulled on me as well. There was something beautiful and good in what I had originally discovered about Christianity. I had discovered the source of the beauty I saw all around me, the Creator himself. I had read the stories of great love and sacrifice by Jesus and his disciples. The words and stories in the Bible expressed a reality I longed to encounter. There I saw a counterintuitive goodness, sacrifice over self-preservation, losing oneself to find oneself. These things seemed to make uncommon sense of my world. Those were the things I was drawn to. She thinks she'll go back to the church someday, but she's not back now. I think at ChurchOne, old church, new soul. I think at ChurchOne, we're trying very hard to not be that, not be the superficial experience, that she describes. For many of us, early experiences with others who follow Christ can impact how we view who God is, not just in challenging ways. Like my mom, married to someone in ministry, would say things like, if those Christians knew what was really going on in our house with your brother, your dad would lose his job. Christians don't do messy. They don't have kids that do drugs, try to take their own lives. But also in good ways, like Ed, who was fortunate to have many men of God, kind men of God, engage with him, pursue a relationship with him in healthy ways. He saw God as being kind and Christians as being trustworthy. He did feel a difference in how many of them lived their lives compared with what he was seeing in his home, where nobody spoke of God as a relational entity. Some of us see God as only a distant being, God the Creator, with no comprehension of why he would send Jesus to earth to die on our behalf. I think Mike Donahue's talked a lot over the last few weeks. He's done a good job about how he wants us to try and stay open to who God is and what he might have for us individually and as a church. I think whenever we read about God in the Bible, we need to be more open to his Spirit to help us see him more clearly and more objectively. He does seem like a mystery. I always believe and have said that I understand how he loves us, wretched and depraved as we can be, because he knows everything about us, how we got to be who we are, why we're stuck in some places in our lives when he would love us to soar like eagles with the power of his Spirit fueling us. It's like my kids. I'm never not going to love them, even though sometimes I wish they could get out of their own way, right? Live lives with more purpose or more joy. Sometimes I think we read verses about him so casually that we're not really drinking in who he is and thinking about his power, his splendor, and his strength. I'm going to read Psalm 29 without having it up on the screen. Crazy. There are lots of references in this passage to the voice of God, and each time I get to the end of a sentence that speaks of his voice, I want us to use our voices in response with the word glory. Now, you could say it loud, you can say it soft. If it makes you uncomfortable or you don't believe it, don't say it at all. I'll just put my hand up so you know when it's time, because sometimes you're like, oh, do I go? I don't want you to be distracted. I want you to be able to just relax into the scripture. I think this will bless God to do this today this way. And I think it will bless the angels who surround him in the heavenly and earthly realms. So if we could all stand, please. It's interesting, during the early morning hours, it was like 4, I think, I was awakened by the wind and the rain. And I thought, given today's text, it was just kind of a cool experience. David starts by referencing heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord, you heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. You know, when they say ascribe, it isn't a matter of us giving him something he doesn't already have. It's a worshipful posture that we're assuming, right? Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The glory of the Lord thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. Glory. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. Cedars have always been a symbol of strength. He makes Lebanon leap like a calf, Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. Glory. The voice of the Lord shakes the desert. Glory. The Lord shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forest bare. Glory. And in his temple all cry, glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king forever. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. Would we follow anyone less powerful? We do it all the time. We spend countless hours following our own agendas or our boss's agenda or other people's, mother-in-law, whoever. Listen to what the late Eugene Peterson says God is whispering to us. It's his version of Matthew 11:28 through 30. Are you tired? You worn out? Burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Just watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Now, the reason I asked you to use your voice today was not for dramatic effect. I can be dramatic. That was not why I did it. It's about starting to see ourselves in relationship with God the Creator, our Creator. I think there's an intimacy in the power of the voice. I've been in radio for a long time. Trust me when I say it. Your voice isn't like anyone else's. How will the sheep know the shepherd? By his voice. Those you are closest to are typically the ones you speak to and with the most. I want to hear God's powerful voice in my life, and I want him to hear mine. I want him to shake the parts of my world that need to be shaken and thunder in the places I need to hear his thunder. It's interesting in the Gospels, flames of fire attend the voice of God. I get so tired of trying to live life on my own strength. It's just exhausting. I have to keep coming back around. He gives strength to his people, and he blesses them with peace. A God who can shake the earth with his power, and yet says with his Spirit alive in us, we will not be shaken. That is a God I can get behind. So while we're standing, let's just ascribe to him the glory due his name. We're going to sing Holy, Holy, Holy together, so if you guys want to come up, that's great. French sociologist Émile Durkheim introduced the term collective effervescence in his 1912 book on the elementary forms of religious life. He originally described it as a type of magic that he would witness during religious ceremonies. He explained that collective effervescence is an experience of connection, communal emotion, and a sensation of sacredness that happens when we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. He said that during these collective effervescent experiences, our focus shifts away from ourselves and onto others. Maybe in this moment, this morning, it'll shift to God. So let's sing it together. Holy, holy, holy.